6 million people call this country home, and according to their own DNA, they shouldn't be standing where they're standing. Somewhere in their genome is a disease found almost nowhere else on the planet, a language that matches nothing around it, and a genetic signature so strange that scientists spent decades trying to explain it. Stick with me until the end, because the answer isn't Sweden, it isn't Russia, and it isn't even the group everyone assumed it would be. And once you see where the trail actually leads, you'll understand why doctors around the world now study this one small country to unlock diseases they can't find answers to anywhere else. Look at a map of Europe, and Finland seems to fit right in. It sits between Sweden and Russia, a short ferry ride from Estonia, boxed in by Norway to the north. You picture Finns as Scandinavian, or close enough. Blonde hair, pale eyes, saunas in the snow. That's the image most people carry without ever questioning it. Nearly 6 million people live in Finland today, and they have lived in that corner of the continent for centuries. So the assumption feels safe. Same region, same neighbors, same rough genetic neighborhood as everyone else in Northern Europe. Geneticists plot European populations on charts called PCA maps, and normally those dots land exactly where the geography says they should. Except one dot doesn't. It drifts off the cluster entirely, toward the edge of the page, alone. That dot is Finland. Finns are not genetically Scandinavian. They aren't Slavic either. On these maps, they sit apart from nearly every population around them, further from their own neighbors than almost any other group in Europe, not close to Sweden, not close to Russia. An island, surrounded by land. So the real question isn't whether Finland fits into Europe's genetic picture. It's narrower than that. If Finns don't match the countries touching their borders, does anything match them at all? Somewhere on the continent, or nowhere? To answer that, researchers didn't rely on old-style blood typing or a handful of markers. They used genome-wide comparisons, scanning hundreds of thousands of genetic variants at once across dozens of European populations, sometimes 40 or more in a single study. One method, called PCA, compresses all that data into a simple plot where related populations cluster together. A second measure, called FST, gives a direct number for genetic distance between any two groups. 0 means identical, 1 means completely unrelated. For most of Europe, this exercise is almost boring. Geography predicts genetics with remarkable accuracy. The French sit near the Germans. The Swedes sit near the Norwegians. Everyone lands where the map says they should. But before the mid-2000s, this kind of full genome comparison simply wasn't possible. Studies leaned on a few genetic markers at a time, too crude to settle anything. Linguists had long argued that Finnish didn't belong with its neighbors at all. Finnish is a Uralic language, unrelated to the Indo-European languages spoken almost everywhere else on the continent. For decades, that was a linguistic footnote. Genetics hadn't caught up enough to say whether it meant anything deeper. While researchers built their comparison, they had to reckon with populations most viewers have never heard of, all speaking Uralic or Finnic languages, all scattered across the same corner of the map. The Sami, around 100,000 people spread across northern Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia, Europe's only reindeer-herding indigenous culture, carrying one of the highest frequencies of a rare mitochondrial lineage found anywhere on the continent. The Karelians, culturally almost identical to Eastern Finns, the people from whose villages Finland's national epic was originally collected, a population later split in two by war. The Vepsians, roughly 6,000 people living between two lakes in northwest Russia, speaking a language with no official written form, barely studied by geneticists until the last decade. The Livonians, once powerful enough that a whole medieval region of Latvia was named after them, reduced by the 2020s to fewer than 20 native speakers. And the Izhorians, a small Finnic group near St. Petersburg, fewer than 100 speakers left, their DNA almost entirely unsampled. 5 populations, 5 candidates. Suddenly the question of who matches Finland doesn't have one obvious answer. It has an entire archipelago of possibilities. Given everything researchers already knew about Europe, there were 2 reasonable predictions. If geography ruled, Finns should match their closest neighbors, Sweden, Norway, or Russia. Every other population on the continent had followed that rule without exception. If language ruled instead, Finns should match another Uralic-speaking group, most likely the Sami, since both peoples share Finnish territory today. Pick one, geography or language. Those were the only two outcomes anyone had reason to expect, and most researchers assumed one of them would win cleanly. What actually happened fit neither one. Start furthest away and work inward. The French, the Germans, the British, all eliminated almost immediately. Their genetic distance from Finland ranks among the largest comparisons anywhere in Europe. The reason traces back 8,000 years to the spread of farming out of Anatolia. That wave reshaped the gene pool of most of the continent. It reached Finland late and thin, less farmer ancestry, more of something older. Western Europe was never really in the running. Next, the neighbor everyone expected to win, Sweden. Finland and Sweden share a border, a sea, and 600 years of shared political history. Swedish ruled as the language of government and class in Finland for centuries. And yet, genetically, Swedes sit closer to Germans and to the British than they do to Finns. Culture crossed that border. Blood barely did. Even today, about 5% of Finns speak Swedish as a first language, a legacy of that long rule. It shows up in surnames, in street signs. It does not show up in the genome. Geography, eliminated. Then the other geographic neighbor, the Eastern Slavs, Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians. Another miss, and a strange one. In the regions of Russia closest to the Finnish border, Arkhangelsk, Vologda, researchers actually find a Finnic genetic substrate inside the Russian population, not the other way around. Genes moved west to east, out of Finland's ancestors and into theirs, not the reverse. Russia doesn't match Finland. If anything, Russia carries a small trace of Finland inside it. The next elimination stings more, because it should have been the one that worked. The Sami, same territory as northern Finland. A Uralic language, like Finnish. Every reasonable prediction pointed here. But on the genetic map, Sami formed their own separate cluster, carrying an ancient Scandinavian component alongside a distinct Siberian-linked signal, in different proportions, and likely from a different source than the one found in Finns. Some researchers now think the Sami represent an older layer of Northern European ancestry, a population already established before Finnic-speaking groups ever arrived. Shared language, shared land, not shared blood. One region left before the obvious neighbors run out. The Baltic states. Latvians and Lithuanians speak Indo-European languages, not Uralic ones, so on paper they shouldn't be close at all. And yet genetically they land nearer to Finland than Scandinavia ever did, closer, but still clearly separate. Baltic languages happen to be some of the most conservative Indo-European languages still spoken, preserving features that vanished from most European languages millennia ago. Their gene pools turn out to be almost as conservative, less mixing, less turnover, over thousands of years. Close, but not the match. Every obvious neighbor is gone now. Scandinavia, gone. The Slavic East, gone. The Sami, gone despite sharing a border and a language family. The Balts, close but still apart. One population remains, sitting directly south across a narrow stretch of water. 80 kilometers separate Helsinki from Tallinn. A short ferry ride, the kind tourists take for a weekend. That is the distance to Estonia. The dot on the chart lines up with the Estonian dot before it lines up with anything else on the continent. Estonians turn out to be the only European population that genuinely clusters with Finns. The genetic distance between them is the smallest of any pairing involving Finland, smaller than Finland and Sweden, smaller than Finland and the Sami. Both populations carry a shared ancestry component linked to Siberia, tracing back toward the Ural Mountains, a signal almost absent from the rest of Europe. Finnish and Estonian both belong to the same language family. Now the DNA says the same thing the language always did. Estonia was the answer. But the answer is not the interesting part. Somewhere after Finland's ancestors split from Estonia's, something happened to the population that had nothing to do with who they were related to and everything to do with how few of them there were. Researchers estimate the founding population of modern Finland at somewhere between 500 and 2,000 people, not a nation. A village spread thin across a cold, mostly empty landscape. And then, centuries later, it happened again. As Finns pushed north and east into new territory in the 15 and 1600s, small groups of families settled vast, isolated regions alone. A bottleneck inside a bottleneck. Small founding populations do something specific to a gene pool. Rare variants, the kind that stay rare everywhere else on Earth, can drift up to noticeable frequencies purely by chance. No advantage required, just isolation and time. In Finland, this produced something doctors now call the Finnish Disease Heritage, a group of roughly 36 genetic conditions that are almost unheard of anywhere else, but occur at measurable rates within Finland's borders. Congenital nephrotic syndrome, aspartyl glucosaminuria, conditions so rare elsewhere that most doctors outside Finland will never see a single case in their career. Finland didn't just drift away from the rest of Europe. It became a magnifying glass. A national research project called FinnGen has enrolled more than 500,000 Finns, roughly 1 in 10 citizens, and used exactly this isolation to uncover gene disease links that stayed invisible in larger, more mixed populations for decades. The same bottleneck that made Finland impossible to match on a map of Europe is the reason its genome has become one of the most valuable tools in modern medicine. The genome comparison was only the first line of evidence, and researchers didn't stop there. Ancient DNA pulled from Mesolithic and early Neolithic remains in Finland tells a second story that lines up with the first. The oldest hunter-gatherer skeletons carry one genetic profile. Later remains carry another, layered with the same Siberian-linked ancestry found in living Finns today. Not a single population sitting still for 10,000 years. A turnover, a replacement, a new group arriving on top of an older one. Archaeology backs this up independently. The comb ceramic culture, and later corded ware sites, appear in the Finnish record at roughly the periods the genetic models predict for these population shifts. Even the medical evidence draws its own map. The rare diseases inside the Finnish Disease Heritage aren't spread evenly across the country. They cluster hardest in the east and the north, the regions settled last, by the smallest founding groups, during that 16th and 17th century expansion. The southwest, settled earliest and most densely, shows the lowest rates of all. 4 separate methods, genomes, ancient bones, archaeological layers, disease maps, all 4 converge on the same story, without needing each other to do it. The Siberian-linked ancestry inside Finnish genomes usually falls somewhere between 7 and 17%, depending on the study. Estonians carry a smaller version of the same signal, closer to 5 to 12%. Swedes carry almost none of it at all. One genetic marker makes the pattern especially visible. A paternal lineage called N1C shows up in roughly 60% of Finnish men. In Swedish men, that number drops below 5%. In most of Western Europe, it barely registers above 0. Small founding populations leave another kind of fingerprint too, something geneticists can measure directly in the length of matching DNA segments within a single person's own 2 chromosome copies. Finns carry noticeably longer stretches of this kind than most other Europeans, a direct trace of how few ancestors originally contributed to the pool. One disease makes the scale of it concrete. A mutation causing a severe kidney condition in newborns appears in roughly 1 in 50 people in Finland. Almost everywhere else on Earth, that number rounds down to 0. If you trace your own ancestry back far enough, most family trees eventually run into a bottleneck somewhere, a moment where the group got small before it got large again. Finland's bottleneck just happened to be recent enough and severe enough to still be readable in the DNA of 6 million living people. Every Finn walking around today carries a faint echo of a population that once numbered in the hundreds. Every rare disease diagnosis that FinnGen helps unlock traces back through that same narrow opening. The rest of the continent spent thousands of years mixing, remixing, blending into the smooth genetic gradient you see on any modern map of Europe. Finland didn't. It held still in the cold, alone, long enough for that stillness to become one of the most useful accidents in the history of human genetics.